What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back once again to bring you the Pokemon card auctions of the week recap. I am glad that you really enjoy seeing tons of auctions because I got a lot for you here today, folks. In today's video, we'll be going over some absolutely insane Grail sales, including a first edition PSA 10 base set Charizard along with a first edition base set booster box. And we'll also be covering a Psyduck Scream promo sale that will absolutely blow your mind. Today's video has no sponsor. I know, a first for everything, right? But I would ask that you please consider being a subscriber to this channel if you're not already. I would really appreciate that. So without further ado, let's jump into this week's auction recap, starting off with some crazy Black Label sales. Here we have the Blaziken VMAX from Silver Tempest, got the BGS 10 Black Label, and sold for $1,175. Along with this Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX from Battle Styles that sold for $1,176. Here we have a Black Label 20th Anniversary Japanese Mew Holo that sold for $2,026. And then we have this Charizard VMAX from Shining Fates that got a Black Label and sold for an even $4,000. Here we have the Mewtwo V-Star from Crown Zenith, also got a Black Label and sold for $4,400 this week. Here is the Rayquaza VMAX from Evolving Skies that sold as a Black Label for $8,750 big ones. On to a couple of absolute bangers from Celebrations. You know Celebrations has been doing very well recently. Here is the Mimikyu promo in PSA 10 that sold for $292 and then again for $305. Here we have the Full Art Pikachu from Celebrations that sold for $596 this week. Here's the Gold Star Greninja that sold as a PSA 10 for $560. Here we have a Light Toxtricity in PSA 10 that sold for $830. And from what I understand, this is a rather low pop card considering how many have been graded, so there you go. Up next, we have a couple of lots of cards. Here is the Chinese Umbreon Full Art cards. All 6 of these cards are PSA 10s and sold for a total of $4,355. Along with this lot of Charizard GX cards, I believe we have a Japanese, an English copy, and I think a Chinese variant, all got a Black Label and sold for $9,800 this week. Up next, a couple very noteworthy auctions from the XY era. Here is a Shaman EX Full Art card. This is a promo in PSA 10, sold for $3,900. Here is the Mew EX promo, sold as a PSA 10 for $4,850. And then from Primal Clash, we saw this Full Art Swampert in PSA 10 sell for $1,075. Here is the Full Art Groudon EX from Primal Clash that sold for $7,700 this week. And then from Ancient Origins, we saw another Giratina EX sell for $2,300. Here is a Primal Kyogre EX that sold for $3,099.99. And then from the Generations Radiant collection, we saw this Gardevoir EX sell as a PSA 10 for $2,226, while the Mega Gardevoir EX sold for $4,100. And then lastly, for the XY cards, we have this PSA 9 Full Art Gengar EX from Phantom Forces that sold for $2,337. Up next, we have several cards from the Black and White era. Here's a Lugia EX from Plasma Storm, sold for $960 this week. And then we saw this Latios EX from Plasma Freeze. This is a Full Art card, sold as a PSA 10 for $3,300, while the Latios EX sold for $4,250. And then here from Plasma Freeze is this Garchomp in PSA 10 that sold for $5,300 this week. Here we have the Full Art Reshiram from Black and White base, sold for $5,100, while the Full Art Zekrom here sold for $3,161. Here we have a Gold Reshiram EX from Legendary Treasures that sold for $6,036. And then here is the Full Art Darkrai EX from Dark Explorers came by again. This week it sold for $9,600. On to some vintage cards from eBay. We have yet again a PGC 10 first edition base set Charizard. And even in the listing here it says it might get a PSA 7 or 8. That is if it's not like altered in some way, but it sold in auction for $14,140. Here we have an unlimited Mewtwo from base set in PSA 10 that sold for $1,925. Here's an unlimited Venusaur from base set that sold for $2,362, along with this reverse hollow Venusaur from Legendary Collection that sold for $4,905. Up next from Jungle, we have the first edition Pikachu in PSA 10. Did pretty well this week, selling for $517. And folks, if you've been watching this channel, you know the history of this card has been extreme. At one time, it was like a $1,000 card, then it went down below $100. Now we come up to the middle mark here, around $500 for a PSA 10 copy. From Fossil Set, we saw this Japanese Hollow Gengar in PSA 10 sell for $2,075, while the unlimited English Gengar Hollow sold for $4,347. Here is an unlimited Zapdos from Fossil. This is the hollow version that sold for $789, while the first edition example sold for $1,511. Here we have an unlimited Articuno hollow that sold for $1,542, while the first edition copy sold for $4,900 this week. Here is an unlimited Dark Raichu from Team Rocket, sold for $2,801. Here we have a first edition Rockets Mewtwo from Gym Challenge. They got the NBA Gold Diamond stamp on there as well, sold as a PSA 10 for $3,627 this week, along with this first edition Blaine's Charizard that sold for $7,007. Here we have a couple of cards from the Neo series. Here's the unlimited Houndour hollow from Neo Discovery, sold as a PSA 10 for $1,926. Pretty low pop card here. Here's the unlimited Umbreon, also from Neo Discovery, that sold for $5,701. Here from Neo Destiny was this Light Arcanine hollow. This is the unlimited version that sold for $2,600. And then we saw this PSA 9 first edition Shining Charizard sell for $7,550. Up next, we have a couple of E-Series cards. Here's a BGS 9.5 Mew hollow from Expedition. One of the prettiest Mew cards of all time, sold for $11,911. Along with this Crystal Nidoking that sold as a PSA 10 for $6,350. And then we saw this PSA 9 Crystal Charizard sell for $14,150. On to some incredible cards from the EX era. We have this reverse hollow Squirtle from Fire Red Leaf Green, one of the best Squirtle cards of all time, if you ask me. Sold as a PSA 10 for $2,025. Here's a reverse hollow Snorlax from EX Dragon Frontiers that sold for $5,100. Here's a reverse hollow Raichu from Power Keepers that sold for $1,575. Here's a Salamence EX, also from Power Keepers, sold for $2,050. And then we saw not one, not two, but three Cold Star Celebes in PSA 10 come by. This one here sold for $10,300. The other one sold for $10,200. And the last one sold for $10,719. So, pretty similar prices there, pretty consistent. Here's a PSA 10 Gold Star Alakazam that sold for $13,100. Here's the PSA 10 Gold Star Mewtwo that sold for $24,100. And the PSA 10 Gold Star Pikachu sold for $37,101. Peeps be offloading their Gold Stars. I mean, with prices like this, can you really blame them? A couple of more reverse hollow cards. Here's the reverse hollow Latios from Holon Phantoms, sold as a PSA 10 for $3,050, while the reverse hollow Latios sold for $3,800. And then here from Diamond and Pearl Legends Awakened, we have this PSA 10 hollow Mewtwo that sold for $7,178 this week. From Platinum Supreme Victors, we have this hollow Articuno that sold for $2,025. Here is a Salamence Level X from Arceus that sold for $4,650. And then a handful of PSA 10 Prime cards came by from Heart Gold Soul Silver. Here's a Machamp that sold for $860. The Raichu Prime Hollow sold for $2,550. Here's an Absol from Heart Gold Soul Silver Triumphant that sold for $1,375. And then here we have the Japanese Daisuke Club 7200 point promo Espeon in PSA 9 that sold for $9,839, while the PSA 9 Umbreon here sold for $20,100. And then here is the start of many booster box sales we saw come by. Here is an XY Flashfire booster box, sold for $8,101. Here's a team-up box that sold for $9,781. Here's a Platinum Arceus box that sold for $13,961. And then on to the weekly and monthly Fanatics Collect auction blocks. Here we have a Korean First Edition base set Gyarados in PSA 10 Pop 7 card, sold for $2,370. And it's been my experience that of all the variants, all the language variants of base set, the Korean cards seem to be the least populated, at least in my experience. Here we have a CGC 10 Pristine Mew EX Special Illustration Rare that sold for $2,400. From Neo Revelation, we have this Unlimited Misdreavus Holo in PSA 10. This is also a very low pop card, only population of 7. PSA 10 sold for $4,080. We saw this Mega Latios EX from Roaring Skies come by in PSA 10, sold for $4,920. And then here we have an absolutely beautiful PSA 10 Ninetales from EX Dragon Frontiers. This is a reverse holo card that sold for an even $6K this week. Here we have a PSA 10 Unlimited Shining Tyranitar that sold for $6,900. Here is another PSA 10 First Edition Blaine's Charizard that also sold for $6,900. And then here we have a PSA 10 E-Card Sample Pichu that also sold for $6,900. Here is a PSA 10 Topps Chrome Sparkle Snorlax that sold for $7,200. Here we have a CGC 10 Pristine First Edition French base set Blastoise that sold for $7,800. Here we have an autographed CGC 10 French First Edition base set Charizard that sold for $15,300. Here we have a Japanese promo Pikachu in PSA 10, a Pop 4 card, sold for $12,000 this week. Up next we have a PSA 9 Gold Star Umbreon that sold for $16,200. Here's another sample card. This is the Pikachu in PSA 10, sold for $19,800. Here we have a PSA 10 First Edition base set Venusaur that sold for $19,800. Here is a black and white Plasma Storm Charizard in PSA 10, sold for $21,600. Here we have a PSA 9 Gold Star Rayquaza, sold for $23,400 this week. And then here is a 1997 Japanese Top Sun Blueback note number Pikachu in PSA 10 that sold for $23,400. And then up next we saw several high-end booster boxes come by in auction. Here is an EX Dragon booster box that sold for $42,700. Here is a Platinum Supreme Victors booster box, and in this box you do get the coveted Charizard G Level X card, and it sold for $17,080. Here's an EX Hidden Legends booster box that sold for $36,600. Here is an EX Sandstorm box that sold for $24,400. Here we have an EX Ruby and Sapphire booster box that sold for $21,960. We also saw a Japanese base set booster box come by that sold for $42,700. Here we have another PSA 10 First Edition base set Venusaur that sold for $17,080, along with the PSA 10 First Edition base set Charizard that sold in auction for $256,200. Which brings us to the First Edition base set booster box that also sold for $256,200. And the auction of the week we got to give to this Psyduck Scream promo. No, not this PSA 10 copy that sells for about $4,850. No, not this BGS 10 Pristine copy that sells for $5,655. I'm talking about the Black Label copy that sold this week for $66,000. This is a Pop 3 Black Label card, and what's really unique about it is not only does it have Psyduck on it, but compared to the other Scream promos, this card has the Haunter and Gengar behind the Pokemon, which is extra awesome. And yeah, this is definitely a new record price for this card. Folks, that's all I got for you. I hope you enjoyed the recap. I know I did. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. I look forward to hearing from you. That's all I got for you today, and I will catch you in my next one.